Every evening, a starving German Shepherd puppy appeared at a lonely retired Navy SEAL's cabin, carrying tiny gifts no one would ever value: a wet stick, an old bottle cap, a torn piece of cloth. Ethan thought the puppy was asking for food, but when he finally followed those strange little offerings into the stormy Blue Ridge woods, he discovered the truth. The gifts were not for him. They were a desperate map leading to another puppy hidden in the dark. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of loyalty, faith, and second chances touch your heart, please subscribe and join our family. Early autumn rain moved softly across the Blue Ridge Mountains, turning the pines silver, the dirt road black, and the old cabin roof into a tired drum that never stopped beating. Ethan Walker had been living there for 26 days, though living was a generous word for what he did. He was 39, tall and broad-shouldered, with the hard athletic frame of a man who had spent most of his adult life obeying orders before the sun came up. His dark brown hair was cut short out of habit, his jaw square and often clenched, his face clean-shaven except for the faint shadow he stopped bothering to fight after noon. There was a narrow scar near his left eyebrow, pale against weathered skin, and blue-gray eyes that had once scanned doorways, rooftops, and ridgelines for danger. Now those eyes mostly watched rain slide down the kitchen window. Ethan had served 12 years as a Navy SEAL, but the war had not ended for him when he came home. It had simply grown quieter, crawled beneath his ribs, and learned to wait. The cabin belonged to his uncle, Henry Walker, a retired forest ranger in his late 60s, a lean, stooped man with sun-browned skin, a gray mustache, and the dry humor of someone who had spent more time talking to trees than people. Henry had moved into town after a mild stroke left his right hand unreliable, and he had offered Ethan the cabin with a shrug, pretending it was just practical. "Quiet place," he had said, "might do you some good." Ethan had nodded because nodding was easier than explaining that quiet could sometimes be louder than gunfire. His days had become small and empty. He woke before dawn whether he wanted to or not, made coffee too strong, stood beside the stove until the cup cooled in his hand, then sat near the window as if the forest might eventually give him instructions. He ignored most phone calls. He ate because the body insisted. He slept on the couch instead of the bedroom because the bedroom felt too much like surrender. He told himself he was resting, but deep inside, in the locked room where honest thoughts paced like wolves, he knew he was hiding. Grace Bennett came by twice a week, though Ethan had never asked her to. She was 31, tall but lightly built, with auburn hair usually twisted into a loose knot, fair skin freckled from years outdoors, and steady green eyes that noticed too much without making a person feel watched. Grace worked as a wildlife rescue volunteer and helped Henry check on the old ranger property. She had the quiet patience of someone who understood wounded animals, and wounded men were rarely grateful at first. She would leave a paper bag by the door, eggs, bread, coffee, sometimes soup in a jar with a handwritten label. She never stayed long. She would ask if he was eating, and Ethan would say yes even when the answer was barely. She would ask if he was sleeping, and he would give the same flat nod. Grace never pushed. That was the strange mercy of her. She seemed to know that some pain, if dragged into daylight too quickly, did not heal. It bit. That afternoon the rain thinned to a mist, and Ethan sat on the porch with his boots planted on the damp boards, a chipped mug beside him, and no memory of drinking from it. The forest breathed around him. Water fell from pine needles in slow drops. Fog crawled low between the trunks like an old ghost looking for a name it had forgotten. Ethan was staring at nothing when a movement near the tree line pulled his attention sharp. At first, he thought it was a fox or a raccoon. Then the small shape stepped forward, hesitated, and became something else entirely. A German Shepherd puppy stood at the edge of the clearing, soaked black and tan fur clinging to a thin body, ribs faintly visible beneath the wet coat. It could not have been more than 6 or 7 weeks old. Its paws looked too large for its legs, its ears were not fully upright yet, one lifting bravely while the other folded at the tip, and its amber eyes held a wary intelligence that seemed far older than its tiny frame. The puppy did not bark. It did not whine. It simply watched Ethan with the grave seriousness of a messenger arriving from some small, muddy kingdom. Something pale rested in its mouth. Ethan did not move. Some instinct, older than training, told him not to break whatever fragile decision had brought the creature this close. The puppy took one step, then another, each paw sinking softly into the wet earth. When it reached the bottom porch step, it lowered its head and placed a small piece of fresh wood on the ground. The stick was smooth on one end as if chewed and bright with rain. Then the puppy backed away. Not in panic, not in submission. Almost formally, as though it had completed a duty of great importance and now waited to see whether the lonely man on the porch understood. Ethan stared at the piece of wood. Then he looked at the puppy. For the first time in weeks, something inside him shifted. Not healed, not saved, not even hopeful yet, but disturbed from its grave-like stillness. He leaned forward slowly, picked up the tiny gift and held it in his palm. The puppy's folded ear twitched. A breath caught in Ethan's chest, dangerously close to a laugh, or maybe something softer. Before he could decide what to do, the little German shepherd turned and slipped back toward the misty trees, leaving Ethan alone on the porch with rain on his sleeves, a piece of wood in his hand, and the unsettling feeling that the forest had just remembered he was there. The next afternoon came washed in pale gold, as if the rain had finally grown tired and left the Blue Ridge forest steaming beneath a thin autumn sun. Ethan Walker told himself he was not waiting. A man could sit on his own porch without waiting. A man could drink bitter coffee at 4 p.m. and stare at the same tree line without expecting anything to emerge from it. The mind, however, was a sly creature, and his kept returning to the small piece of wood on the kitchen table. It lay there beside an unopened envelope from the Department of Veterans Affairs, a dead phone, and a knife he had sharpened twice that morning for no reason at all. The wood looked foolish in that company, almost wholly because of how useless it was. Ethan had thought about throwing it into the stove, but when his fingers touched it, he remembered the puppy's amber eyes and the careful way it had stepped back after placing the gift down. So, the wood stayed. Around noon, Ethan had even caught himself looking through the window to make sure it was still there, as though the little scrap might vanish and prove the whole thing had been a trick of rain and loneliness. By late afternoon, the porch boards had dried in patches. The air smelled of pine sap, wet leaves, and old smoke from the cabin chimney. Ethan sat in his usual chair, one boot resting on the lowest step, shoulders stiff beneath a faded navy sweatshirt. His face gave away little, but inside him something restless had begun to pace. It irritated him. He had survived ambushes, ocean nights, desert heat, briefings where one wrong word could mean death, and yet now one muddy puppy had him listening to every snap of twig like a nervous old farmer guarding his corn from squirrels. He almost laughed at himself, but the sound did not come. Then, near the low ferns at the edge of the clearing, the small shape returned. The German shepherd puppy stepped from the trees with the same solemn caution, its black and tan coat drier now but still rough, its thin sides moving quickly with each breath. One ear lifted higher than the day before, while the other folded at the tip like it had lost an argument with gravity. In its mouth was something round and green. The puppy paused when it saw Ethan, not frightened exactly, but calculating. Ethan did not lean forward. He did not speak. He had learned long ago that trust could be ruined by a man who wanted too badly to earn it. The puppy came closer, paws leaving soft prints in the damp dirt. At the bottom step it lowered its head and dropped an old green bottle cap, scratched along the rim and dull with mud. Then it backed away, eyes never leaving him. Ethan looked at the cap, then at the puppy. "You running a delivery service now?" he muttered. His voice sounded strange from lack of use, rough as gravel poured into a tin cup. The puppy blinked. For one absurd second, Ethan had the feeling it was unimpressed with the joke. That nearly broke him. A small breath escaped his nose, not quite a laugh, but closer than anything he had managed in weeks. The puppy turned and slipped back into the woods, swift and silent, leaving the green cap behind like a coin paid to some forgotten ferryman. Ethan waited until the trees swallowed it completely. Only then did he pick up the cap. It was cold, wet, meaningless. He carried it inside anyway and placed it beside the piece of wood. The two objects looked ridiculous together. They also looked deliberate. The following day, the puppy returned with a narrow length of cord, pale and frayed at one end, as if it had been pulled from something larger. It placed the cord lower than the cap, farther from the porch, and this time it lingered a little longer before leaving. Ethan noticed the way its eyes flicked past him toward the cabin door, toward the table visible through the window, as though checking whether the previous gifts had been honored. That thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He had spent the last month believing nothing expected anything from him anymore. No squad, no mission, no family waiting with questions he could not answer. No one needing him to be early, steady, useful, alive in any particular way. Yet this tiny creature, all bones and stubborn courage, kept arriving with treasures no kingdom would claim, and somehow Ethan felt he had been assigned a duty without being asked. So he kept the cord, too. He laid it beside the wood and the bottle cap, lining them up without thinking, then immediately scattered them again, because order made the whole thing feel too important. That evening, Grace Bennett came by with a canvas grocery bag looped over one arm. She wore a faded green field jacket, dark jeans tucked into muddy boots, and a cream scarf that made her auburn hair look brighter against the gray light. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and a few loose strands had escaped her knot, clinging to her temple. Grace had a way of entering a place gently, as if every room might contain a sleeping animal or a sorrow with sharp teeth. She set the bag on the counter and noticed the little collection before Ethan could move it. Her green eyes rested on the wood, the cap, and the cord, then shifted to him. "New hobby?" she asked. "Collecting trash from the yard?" Ethan said. Grace smiled, but only a little. She had the kind of smile that did not mock a wound for wearing armor. "That puppy came back?" Ethan looked toward the window. "Twice. And brought those?" He shrugged, a soldier's old defense against being understood. "Could be coincidence." Grace stepped closer to the table, careful not to touch anything. Animals don't usually make a habit out of coincidence. Ethan did not answer. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere far off a crow complained like an elderly preacher disappointed in the congregation. Grace followed his gaze toward the tree line. "I've seen a young German shepherd around the old storage shed off Miller's Trail," she said quietly. "The one past the logging road. Roof half caved in, boards missing on the west side." Ethan's jaw tightened. "How long?" "A week, maybe more. Hard to tell. It never lets me close." You try to catch it?" "Once." Grace's voice softened. "It didn't run like a normal stray. It backed away like it had somewhere it needed to return to." Ethan looked at her then. Grace did not dramatize things. That was what made her words land harder. She reached into the grocery bag and took out a paper carton of eggs, a small loaf of bread, and a packet of ground coffee, setting each one down with quiet precision. "There's something else," she said. "On the mud near the bend in the trail, I saw tracks yesterday. Small paws. More than one set, I think." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "More than one puppy?" "Maybe, or the same one circling." She hesitated, and that pause carried the weight of a person choosing honesty over comfort. But one set looked different, smaller, deeper in the front, like whatever made them was limping or carrying its weight wrong. The cabin seemed to grow still around them. Ethan looked at the little row of useless gifts on the table, and they no longer seemed useless. The wood, the cap, the cord, each one felt like a word in a language he did not yet speak. He turned back to the window, where the first blue shadows of evening had begun to gather beneath the trees. He wanted to tell himself it was not his problem. He wanted to believe the forest had plenty of secrets and none of them belonged to him. But the green bottle cap caught a thin blade of fading light, and for reasons Ethan could not name, it looked less like trash than a signal. Outside, somewhere beyond the pines, one small creature knew the way to his porch, and maybe another one, weaker and hidden, was waiting in the dark. By the fourth evening, the forest had changed its voice. The Blue Ridge wind no longer whispered through the pines with the soft patience of rain. It moved in colder breaths, slipping under the porch boards, combing through the wet grass, tapping loose branches against one another like old bones remembering a song. Ethan Walker sat outside longer than he meant to, his faded navy sweatshirt pulled tight across his broad shoulders, his hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold an hour earlier. On the kitchen table behind him lay the strange little offerings, the smooth scrap of wood, the green bottle cap, the frayed cord. He had stopped pretending they were nothing, though pride still made him avoid saying what they were. They were a pattern. They were a question. They were, somehow, the closest thing to a conversation he had allowed in almost a month. The puppy did not come. Ethan watched the tree line until the sky darkened from gray to blue-black, and the trunks became tall, narrow shadows standing shoulder to shoulder like silent witnesses. He told himself it was fine. The little German shepherd was wild, or nearly wild. It belonged to the forest, to hunger, to instinct, to whatever hidden den it returned to after leaving its ridiculous treasures at his steps. It did not belong to him. It owed him no visit, no explanation, no loyalty. Yet the longer the clearing stayed empty, the more the silence pressed against his ribs. He stood once, walked inside, set the mug in the sink, then came back to the door as if he had forgotten something. Nothing was there, only dark grass, only fog, only the low smell of damp wood and leaves beginning to rot under the season's slow hand. He almost closed the door. Then, somewhere far off beyond the first rise of trees, a faint metallic bang rolled through the woods. It was followed by another sound, smaller, sharper, not quite a cry, not quite the wind. Ethan went still. Old training moved through him before thought could. His spine straightened, his eyes narrowed, and the tired man in the cabin briefly became the man who had once read danger from broken light and distant echoes. He took the flashlight from the hook beside the door, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside without bothering to grab his coat. The beam cut a pale tunnel through the dark as he crossed the yard and entered the trees. The ground was soft from days of rain, sucking lightly at his boots. Branches brushed his sleeves. Somewhere above him an owl called once and then seemed to regret being heard. Ethan followed Miller's trail, the old logging path Grace had mentioned, though the path was barely more than a wound in the woods now, half hidden by ferns and fallen pine needles. Every few yards he swept the light low. Twice he saw paw prints in the mud. One set was small but clear, the same wide-pawed marks he had seen near the porch. The other was fainter, uneven, dragging slightly at the front. Grace had been right. There was another animal. Ethan crouched, touched the edge of one print with 2 fingers, and felt an odd heaviness settle in his chest. For years, he had been trained to follow tracks toward enemies, hostages, extraction points, the geometry of survival. Now he was following the small, imperfect marks of something too young to understand why the world had become cruel. The trail bent downward toward a hollow where the trees thinned around an abandoned storage shed. The building squatted in the dark like a tired beast, its roof sagging, its west wall stripped of several boards, its tin panels trembling whenever the wind passed through. It had once belonged to a logging company, maybe decades ago, though now it looked less built than forgotten. The moon hid behind thick clouds, and the flashlight showed only fragments. A rusted hinge, broken glass, weeds growing through the floorboards, a length of old chain curled in the mud. Then Ethan saw movement near the shed's outer wall. The puppy was there. The little German shepherd stood half behind a stack of warped planks, black and tan fur bristling, body low, amber eyes shining in the light. Ethan had begun, privately and foolishly, to call him Scout, because the pup moved like one, cautious, observant, always arriving first, always retreating before the world could close its hand around him. Scout was still painfully thin, his ribs visible beneath his damp coat, one ear upright and the other folded at its soft tip. He trembled, but he did not run. That mattered. Ethan lowered the flashlight so the beam fell on the mud between them instead of into the pup's eyes. "Easy," he said, his voice rough but quiet. Scout took one step backward, then stopped. His gaze flicked toward the opening in the shed wall. Ethan followed it. At first, there was only blackness inside, thick and stale, smelling of mold, wet straw, and old oil. Then the flashlight beam slid across the corner, and two more eyes appeared. They were smaller, darker, reflecting the light from low in a nest of damp hay and torn burlap. Ethan's breath caught. Another German Shepherd puppy lay curled against the back wall, half hidden beneath the broken edge of a wooden pallet. This one was smaller than Scout, perhaps from the same litter but weaker, with a softer face, a narrower muzzle, and fur that should have been black and tan but was muddied into dull brown along the belly and legs. A pale streak marked the bridge of her nose, thin as a brushstroke. One front paw was tucked awkwardly beneath her chest, and when she tried to lift her head, her whole body shivered from the effort. Ethan knew without touching her that the paw was hurt. Maybe sprained, maybe cut, maybe worse. She was not trapped by wood or wire. She was trapped by pain, noise, and fear. The wind shoved through the broken shed, and a loose tin sheet slammed against the frame with a hollow crash. The smaller puppy flinched so violently she pressed herself flat into the hay. Scout turned toward her at once, placing his tiny body between Ethan and the corner, not aggressive, not foolish, simply loyal beyond his size. In that moment, Ethan understood. Scout had not been bringing gifts because he wanted attention. He had not been visiting the porch because the cabin smelled of food or because Ethan's silence amused him. The wood, the cap, the cord, those pitiful treasures were not random offerings from a lonely stray. They were pieces of this place, carried one by one from the edge of danger to the doorstep of the only human who had not chased him, grabbed him, or demanded he be less afraid. Ethan lowered himself slowly onto one knee, ignoring the wet mud soaking into his jeans. He kept his hands visible and still. The smaller puppy watched him from the hay, eyes wide with the terrible faith of creatures that have not yet learned whether mercy is real. "I see her," Ethan whispered, more to Scout than to himself. "I see her now." Scout's folded ear twitched. For several seconds nothing moved except the wind and the trembling sheet metal. Ethan did not reach for them. Every instinct in his body wanted to scoop the injured pup into his arms, tuck Scout against his chest, and carry them both back to warmth. But instinct had failed him before when it came dressed as control. So he stayed where he was. He let the space remain open. He let Scout guard the secret he had finally managed to reveal. After a while, Ethan reached into his sweatshirt pocket and found the green bottle cap he had carried without realizing it, turning it once between his thumb and forefinger. He placed it gently on the mud between them. Scout stared at it, then at Ethan, then back toward the smaller puppy. The shed groaned. The woods leaned close. And Ethan felt the truth settle inside him with the weight of an oath. The little gifts on his table were not trash, not miracles, not accidents. They were a map, a plea, a trail of tiny, broken stars leading him to the life hidden behind the trees. By morning, the secret in the old shed had followed Ethan Walker back to the cabin like a second shadow. He had slept badly, if the few broken hours on the couch could be called sleep at all. Each time the wind tapped a branch against the window, he saw Willow's small body pressed into the damp hay, her injured paw tucked beneath her chest, her eyes shining from the dark as if hope itself frightened her. Scout had stood guard between them, all ribs and courage, a tiny soldier with one crooked ear and a heart too large for his thin body. Ethan moved through the cabin before sunrise with the stiff, contained energy of a man trying not to feel. He washed the same mug twice, sharpened the same knife without needing it, and stood over the 3 little gifts on the table as though they were evidence in a case he had not yet solved. Wood, bottle cap, cord. Not treasures, not exactly. Not toys either. They were messages. The problem was that Ethan had spent half his life answering messages with action. If someone was trapped, you got them out. If a structure was unsafe, you cleared it. If a body was hurt, you moved before fear had time to negotiate. By 10 that morning, Grace Bennett arrived in her old blue pickup, tires crunching over the damp gravel. She stepped out wearing her green field jacket, her auburn hair braided this time to keep it from the wind, a pair of work gloves tucked into her back pocket. Her face, usually calm in that careful way of hers, changed when she saw Ethan waiting on the porch. "You found the second one," she said. It was not really a question. Ethan nodded once. "Front paw's bad. She's holed up inside the shed." Grace looked toward the woods and the softness in her green eyes tightened into focus. "How close did you get?" "Close enough to see her, not close enough to help." "That may be why they didn't run." She turned back to the truck and opened the tailgate. Inside were a plastic animal carrier, 2 folded wool blankets, a bag of puppy food, a stainless steel bowl, and a small first aid kit. Ethan looked at the carrier first. It was gray, practical, clean, with a wire door that clicked shut. He hated it immediately, though he did not understand why. Grace lifted it carefully, as if she already knew the thing could become a threat in the wrong hands. "We go slow," she said. "No sudden moves, no blocking their exit, no cornering them. If they feel trapped, especially Willow, they may bolt deeper into the shed or into the brush, and then we lose them." Ethan took the blankets from her. "The shed isn't safe." "I know. That paw could get infected. I know that, too." Her voice stayed even, but not cold. Grace had the rare gift of disagreeing without making it sound like war. "But fear can injure them faster than the shed if we rush this." Ethan said nothing. He carried the supplies inside, jaw tight, shoulders squared beneath his sweatshirt. Grace watched him with the quiet sorrow of someone who had seen strong men mistake urgency for love. They set food near the porch first, farther from the steps than Ethan wanted. Grace mixed warm water into a small amount of puppy food until the smell rose rich and meaty in the cold air. "Let Scout decide," she said. "He's the bridge. If he trusts the yard, Willow may eventually follow." Ethan looked at the forest. Eventually isn't a plan. For animals like this, eventually is often the only plan that works. He almost snapped back, but swallowed it. Grace did not deserve the sharp edge of a wound she had not made. That afternoon, Ethan placed the carrier near the side of the porch, half covered with one of the blankets so it looked less like a trap. Grace had suggested leaving the door open, food nearby, no pressure. Ethan followed every instruction, but his body betrayed him. He stood too straight. He watched too closely. He measured distances, routes, angles, like the clearing had become a mission site. When Scout appeared at the tree line, the puppy stopped so abruptly that one paw lifted and stayed suspended in the air. His amber eyes moved from Ethan to the carrier, then back to Ethan. The change was immediate. Scout's body lowered. His tail tucked slightly. He did not come forward with the confident solemnity of the previous days. He did not carry wood or metal or cord. In his mouth was only a wet brown leaf trembling between his teeth. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "It's all right," he murmured. Scout took one step closer, then saw the carrier door glint beneath the blanket. He dropped the leaf in the grass several yards from the porch, far beyond the place where he usually left his gifts. Then he backed away. Not a retreat into panic. Worse, a decision. He turned and vanished into the trees without eating. Willow did not appear at all. Grace exhaled softly beside Ethan. She did not say, "I told you so." That mercy made the failure heavier. "Leave the food," she said. "He might come back after dark." Ethan stared at the wet leaf lying alone in the grass. It looked smaller than the other gifts, less like an offering and more like an apology. Evening came. The food remained untouched. Ethan sat at the table with the carrier by the door, its open mouth facing the room like a question he did not want to answer. The wood, cap, cord, and leaf lay before him now, not arranged, but gathered. His hands rested on either side of them. He remembered the first month after he came home, when men with kind eyes and official folders had spoken to him about transition plans, therapy options, job placement, support groups, healthy routines. They had meant well, all of them. That was the worst part. Their concern had been real, their advice reasonable, their plans probably useful. But to Ethan, fresh from a world where every sound carried consequence, those offers had felt like hands on his back pushing him toward a door before he knew whether the room beyond it was safe. Everyone wanted him better. Everyone wanted him moving. Everyone wanted him to become proof that leaving war was the same as surviving it. Now he saw himself standing over two frightened puppies with blankets, food, and a carrier, holding out safety as if safety were something he could force them to recognize. His throat tightened with a shame that was quiet, but merciless. He had told himself he wanted to rescue them. Maybe that was true, but beneath it was something less noble, something lonely and hungry. He wanted them close. He wanted the cabin filled with pause and breath and need. He wanted Scout to come to the porch again and Willow to stop trembling because he had decided it was time. He wanted to be useful so badly that he had almost turned help into another kind of command. Outside, rain began again, light at first, then steadier, silvering the windows. Ethan stood, picked up the carrier, and carried it to the storage room at the back of the cabin. He set it behind a stack of old fishing gear where it could not be seen from the porch. Then he returned to the table, took the wet leaf gently between two fingers, and placed it beside the other gifts. No strategy, no trick, no battlefield plan. Just space. Just patience. Just the hard, humbling work of letting a frightened creature choose. Much later, near midnight, Ethan heard a soft sound on the porch. He did not open the door. He did not turn on the light. He only sat very still in the darkened kitchen listening. A faint scrape, a tiny step. Then silence. When dawn came, he found the food bowl empty, and beside it, one new gift. A small gray stone, damp with rain, placed carefully where the carrier had been. The cold arrived before the storm did, slipping down from the higher ridges like a warning no one had asked for, turning the Blue Ridge morning hard and silver. Ethan Walker woke before dawn to the sound of branches scraping the cabin roof, a restless, clawing rhythm that made the old place seem less like shelter and more like something bracing itself. For a moment he lay still on the couch, one arm across his chest, eyes open in the dim gray light, listening for the small scrape of paws on the porch. Nothing came. Only wind. Only the low groan of timber. Only the soft tick of rain beginning again against the window. The little gray stone Scout had left the night before still sat on the kitchen table beside the other gifts, damp at first, then drying into an ordinary piece of mountain rock. Ordinary things had begun to frighten Ethan more than extraordinary ones. A bottle cap, a strip of cord, a leaf, a stone. Each had somehow become a tiny oath. He stood, made coffee, forgot to drink it, and kept looking toward the trees as the sky darkened with a color that did not belong to morning. Around 9, Henry Walker called. His voice crackled through the old phone line, thin but stubborn, carrying that dry humor Ethan remembered from childhood, though age and the mild stroke had slowed the edges of his words. Henry was in his late 60s, lean as a fence rail, with sun-browned skin, a gray mustache, and a ranger's habit of sounding calm even when delivering bad news. "You near the window?" Henry asked. Ethan glanced outside at the bending pines. "I can see trouble from here." "Then you're looking in the right direction." Henry gave a tired breath. "County office posted notice this morning. That old storage shed off Miller's Trail sits on the parcel the company bought last month. Crews coming in soon to clear it." Maybe 2 days, maybe less if the weather scares them into rushing before the ground gets worse. Ethan's hand tightened around the phone. The shed's occupied. Henry went quiet, and the silence told Ethan his uncle understood more than he had been told. By people? No. Ethan looked at the gifts on the table. 2 pups, German shepherds, 1 hurt. Henry swore softly, not angry at Ethan but at the world and its poor timing. Storm's building, son. Radio says heavy rain by nightfall, strong gusts after dark. That shed has been half dead for 10 years. If the roof shifts wrong— He did not finish. He did not need to. Ethan thanked him, hung up, and stood in the center of the kitchen with the receiver still warm in his hand. For 12 years, danger had usually announced itself with coordinates, briefings, maps, orders, men looking at one another without saying they were afraid. This danger came as rain on glass and 2 puppies hiding in rotting wood. By noon, Grace Bennett arrived, her blue pickup sliding slightly in the mud before settling near the porch. She climbed out with her green field jacket zipped to her throat, auburn braid darkened by mist, cheeks flushed from the cold. Her steady green eyes moved first to Ethan's face, then to the tree line, reading both with the same quiet care. She did not need a long explanation. Ethan gave it anyway, clipped and controlled. The land sale, the crew, the storm, the shed. Grace listened without interrupting, one gloved hand resting against the truck door. "Then we prepare," she said. "Not rush, prepare." Ethan almost smiled, but it came out like a breath. "That your religion?" "With scared animals, pretty much." She opened the truck and showed him what she had brought this time: dry blankets, soft food, a small flashlight, bandage wrap, bottled water, and a towel that smelled faintly of laundry soap and cedar. No carrier. Ethan noticed. Grace noticed him noticing. "You were right to put it away," she said. "Maybe later. Not tonight, unless there's no other choice." The words settled between them with unexpected kindness. All afternoon the storm gathered itself. The trees bent lower, their crowns tossing like dark water. Rain came in waves, first gentle, then hard enough to blur the window. Ethan and Grace set a bowl of food near the porch, then moved back inside, leaving the door cracked so the scent could travel. Ethan had never been good at waiting when waiting was the only moral thing left to do. He paced once, then stopped himself. He checked the flashlight batteries twice. He folded and refolded the same blanket until Grace looked at him with a raised eyebrow and he muttered, "Don't start." She gave a small smile. "I was going to say you missed a corner." For half a second, the cabin held something almost like warmth. Then a gust struck the side wall and both of them looked toward the woods. Evening fell early under the storm clouds. The porch light glowed weakly, turning the rain into bright needles. At first, Ethan saw nothing. Then Scout appeared at the edge of the clearing, not with his careful little ceremony this time, but stumbling forward against the wind, his black and tan coat plastered to his thin body, one ear flattened, the other crooked and brave. Something dark hung from his mouth. He crossed only halfway to the porch before stopping. Ethan opened the door but did not step out. Scout came closer, fighting the rain, and dropped the object on the lowest step. It was a strip of old cloth, soaked through, muddy at one end, pale blue beneath the dirt. Ethan knew before he touched it that it had come from the shed. When he lifted it, a faint smell rose beneath the rain and rot, damp hay, mold, and the warm, frightened scent of willow. Scout stared at him, amber eyes fierce and exhausted. He did not bark, he did not whine, he did not perform the ritual of backing away slowly. He simply stood there trembling, as if he had run out of language and placed the last word at Ethan's feet. Grace moved behind Ethan, quiet as a shadow. "That's not a gift," she whispered. Ethan's throat tightened. "No, it's a summons." He did not reach for the carrier. He did not even look toward the storage room where it was hidden. Instead, he pulled on his coat, took the flashlight, tucked the folded blankets under one arm, and gathered every small offering from the table into the deep pocket of his jacket: wood, cap, cord, leaf, stone, cloth. They were absurd things to take into a storm. They were also the only things that had ever truly belonged to the trust between them. Grace grabbed the first aid kit and followed him out, but she kept several steps back, close enough to help and far enough to let Scout see Ethan as the one answering. The rain hit hard, cold against his face, running down his neck. Scout turned toward the trees, then looked back once. Ethan nodded, though he did not know if dogs understood nods or if frightened hearts understood anything but presence. "Lead on, little man," he said. Scout plunged into the woods. Ethan followed. Behind them, Grace came with the blankets pressed beneath her coat and her flashlight angled low. Miller's trail had become a ribbon of mud, slick beneath Ethan's boots. Branches lashed in the wind, and twice Scout vanished into the dark only to reappear ahead, waiting, shaking, refusing to abandon the slow humans behind him. The storm made the forest seem ancient and furious, like some old mountain god had woken with a grudge against roofs, roads, and all fragile things. By the time they reached the hollow, the shed was already crying out under the weather. Tin panels rattled violently, a broken gutter swung like a loose arm. The west wall groaned each time the wind drove through the missing boards. Ethan swept the flashlight across the structure and saw fresh damage. A beam sagging lower, debris scattered near the entrance, hay spilling out like torn stuffing. Scout did not hesitate. He ran straight toward the gap in the wall, then stopped inside the broken frame and turned back. His small body was a dark shape against the trembling ruin, his eyes catching Ethan's light. He looked less like a stray now than a guide at the mouth of an underworld, asking a wounded man to be brave in a way war had never taught him. Ethan slowed his breathing, lowered the flashlight, and stepped toward the shed as the roof shuddered above them. Scout disappeared inside, then looked back once more from the darkness, waiting for Ethan to follow. Inside the old shed, the storm sounded larger than the mountains. Rain hammered the tin roof in furious sheets, and every gust of wind shoved through the broken walls as if the night itself wanted to tear the place open and scatter its bones across the hollow. Ethan Walker stepped in slowly, his flashlight lowered, his tall frame bent beneath a sagging beam that creaked above him. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, rainwater ran along the hard line of his jaw, and his blue-gray eyes moved with the careful discipline of a man trained to notice every danger before it became a disaster. But this was not a battlefield, and the truth of that steadied him. There was no enemy here, only fear, only two small lives trying to survive inside a building that had forgotten how to stand. Grace Bennett remained a few steps behind him near the opening. Auburn braid dark with rain, green field jacket soaked at the shoulders, her face pale but calm. She held the blankets and first aid kit against her chest, keeping her distance the way she had promised, letting Ethan be the one Scout could follow. Scout stood near the broken wall, thin black and tan body trembling from cold and effort, one ear lifted like a tiny flag of defiance while the other folded at the tip. He looked from Ethan to the back corner, then back again, torn between guarding Willow and trusting the man he had summoned through the storm. Willow was half hidden behind a collapsed stack of boards and a cracked wooden pallet. She was smaller than Scout, a fragile German shepherd puppy with muddy black and tan fur, a narrow muzzle, and a pale streak along the bridge of her nose that made her face look almost painted by a gentle hand. Her injured front paw was tucked close to her chest. She was not pinned beneath the boards, but she might as well have been chained there by terror. Every time the roof groaned, her body pressed lower into the damp straw. Ethan saw the shape of the problem quickly. If he rushed forward, Scout might bolt. If Scout bolted, Willow would panic. If Willow panicked, she could crawl deeper beneath the wreckage or hurt herself worse. The old part of Ethan, the soldier, wanted movement. Clear the boards, secure the injured, exit before collapse. Simple. But the man who had sat alone with a wet leaf and a gray stone on his table knew better now. Some rescues failed because they arrived wearing the face of force. Ethan lowered himself to one knee on the cold floor. Mud soaked through his jeans almost instantly. He did not call to Willow. He did not reach for Scout. He only breathed, slow and visible in the cold air, and opened his left hand so both puppies could see it held nothing. "All right," he said quietly, not as a command but as a promise. "We do this your way." Scout's eyes fixed on him. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and took out the first gift, the small piece of wood, smooth on one end from tiny teeth and rain-darkened from its journey. He placed it on the floor between them. Scout's head lowered. His nostrils moved. The storm crashed against the roof, but the puppy did not run. Ethan took out the green bottle cap next, scratched and dull, then the pale frayed cord, then the wet brown leaf, then the little gray stone, then the strip of old blue cloth that smelled of willow in the shed. One by one he laid them down in a crooked line across the muddy floor. They were ridiculous things against such danger. No rope, no tool, no weapon, no plan drawn by a man in uniform. Yet in that trembling shelter they became something older than words. Proof. Proof that Scout had come. Proof that Ethan had listened. Proof that nothing given in trust had been thrown away. Scout took one careful step toward the wood. Ethan kept his gaze low, not staring, not demanding. Scout touched the wood with his nose, then the cap, then the cord. His small body shook, but with each object his breathing changed. The gifts were familiar ground in an unfamiliar moment. They were a bridge laid across fear by a puppy who had nothing else to build with. When Scout reached the strip of cloth, he paused and looked back at Willow. The smaller puppy whimpered, so softly it almost disappeared beneath the storm. Scout turned and patted to her, moving with a tenderness that made Ethan's throat tighten. He nudged Willow's cheek once, then again. She lifted her head. Her ears were low, her amber brown eyes wide and glassy, but she looked past Scout toward the line of objects on the floor. The shed gave a violent shudder. A loose board cracked overhead and fell somewhere to Ethan's right, striking the ground with a sharp slap. Grace gasped behind him, but Ethan did not move. Every instinct in him screamed to cover the puppies with his body, to scoop them up, to take control before the old shed made the choice for them. Instead, he stayed still, one hand open on his knee, the other resting palm up on the floor. Calm, he reminded himself, though his heart beat like thunder inside his chest. Be the safe thing. Not the fast thing. Scout pressed his shoulder gently into Willow's side. Willow tried to stand and failed, her injured paw buckling beneath her. Scout did not leave her. He circled back, touched his nose to her neck, then stepped toward the line of gifts as if showing her the path. Willow watched him, trembling so hard the straw around her quivered. Then, inch by inch, she crawled forward. Not walking yet, not trusting Ethan fully, but moving. Scout returned to her again, patient as a saint and stubborn as a little king. Ethan felt something break open inside him. Not grief, exactly, though grief was there. Not joy, though joy waited somewhere beyond it. It was recognition. This tiny creature had crossed rain, hunger, darkness, and fear, not for himself but for the weaker life behind him. Scout had not asked to be brave. He had simply loved someone who could not make it alone. Willow reached the first gift, the piece of wood, and sniffed it. Her nose twitched. She made another small sound, less frightened this time, more confused, as though the world had suddenly offered her a road where there had only been walls. Ethan did not speak. The roof groaned again. Rain poured through a new gap and splattered across his sleeve. Willow moved to the bottle cap, then the cord. Her injured paw dragged, but she kept coming. Scout walked beside her, sometimes ahead, sometimes back at her shoulder, guiding without pulling. When Willow reached the strip of cloth, she stopped. Ethan's open hand was only a few inches beyond it. Scout looked at Ethan for a long second. Then the brave little puppy stepped forward and placed his head gently into Ethan's palm. The contact was light, barely more than warmth and wet fur, but it struck Ethan harder than any salute, any medal, any word of thanks he had ever been given. His fingers did not close. He did not trap the moment by trying to own it. He simply let Scout rest there. A heartbeat later, Willow hobbled forward and leaned against Ethan's boot, her small body shaking, her muddy fur cold against his leg. Ethan bowed his head, rainwater and something warmer slipping down his face. Behind him, Grace covered her mouth with one gloved hand, eyes shining in the flashlight glow. Ethan reached slowly for the blanket without looking away from the puppies. He draped it near them, not over them yet, giving them space to choose the warmth. Scout stayed against his hand. Willow pressed closer to his boot. Outside, the storm still raged, and the old shed still trembled like a giant on its last breath. But there, on the muddy floor among a chewed piece of wood, a bottle cap, a cord, a leaf, a stone, and a scrap of cloth, Ethan Walker understood that being needed did not always arrive like a command. Sometimes it came shivering through the rain, carrying impossible little gifts, asking only that a broken man become gentle enough to be trusted. He lowered his other hand beside Willow, palm open, and the two puppies leaned into him as if his body had become a doorway out of the dark. By the time Ethan Walker carried Scout and Willow out of the collapsing shed, the storm had begun to lose its fury, though rain still swept across the Blue Ridge Hollow in silver curtains. Grace Bennett walked beside him with one blanket held open against the wind, her auburn braid soaked dark against her shoulder, her green eyes moving between the puppies and the path ahead. Scout did not need to be carried for long. The brave little German shepherd wriggled once, then twice, then insisted on walking close to Ethan's boot as if even rescue had rules, and he preferred to patrol the way home himself. Willow, however, stayed wrapped against Ethan's chest, small and trembling. Her muddy, black and tan fur cold beneath his hands, her injured front paw tucked carefully beneath the blanket. Ethan held her the way a man might hold something sacred and breakable, not tight enough to trap, but firm enough to promise she would not fall. The cabin lights looked impossibly warm when they finally appeared through the trees. For weeks, Ethan had seen that yellow glow as nothing more than electricity in old glass. That night, it looked like a lighthouse. Grace opened the door, and warmth rolled out with the smell of wood smoke, coffee, and the faint cedar scent from the folded towel she had left earlier. Scout stepped inside first, shook water across the floor with heroic enthusiasm, and slipped on the rug with the dignity of a tiny general betrayed by enemy terrain. Ethan surprised himself by laughing, a deep, rough sound that seemed to startle the cabin as much as the puppy. Grace looked over at him, and for once she did not hide her smile. "Careful," she said softly. "If you keep doing that, this place might think it's a home." Ethan looked down at Willow, who had lifted her head just enough to peer at the fire. Maybe it should. The next morning, Grace drove them into town to see Dr. Sarah Miller, a veterinarian in her mid-40s with warm brown skin, silver-streaked black hair cut to her chin, and round glasses that made her serious eyes seem gentler than they probably wanted to be. Sarah had the calm, practical manner of a woman who had delivered calves in snowstorms, stitched farm dogs after fights with barbed wire, and comforted children who thought every limping animal was one breath from heaven. She examined Willow's paw while Scout sat under Ethan's chair, watching every movement with suspicious devotion. "Not broken," Sarah said at last, pressing gently around the swollen joint. "Sprained, sore, a little infected where the skin split, but she's tougher than she looks." Scout gave a tiny huff, as if he had known that already, and found the humans embarrassingly slow. Sarah cleaned the wound, wrapped the paw, sent them home with medicine, food instructions, and a look at Ethan that saw more than puppies. "They'll need patience," she said. "So will you." Ethan nodded. That kind of advice used to annoy him. Now it felt like someone had handed him a map in a country he was finally willing to enter. When they returned to the cabin, Henry Walker called. His voice came through the phone rough and amused, still slowed by the stroke but bright with the old ranger mischief Ethan remembered from boyhood. "Heard you adopted half the mountain," Henry said. "2 German shepherd pups," Ethan replied, watching Scout drag one of Grace's towels across the kitchen like a captured flag. "Not half." "Give them a week." Henry chuckled, then coughed. then chuckled again. That cabin finally has somebody making the right kind of noise. Ethan looked around. Muddy paw prints near the stove, medicine bottles on the counter, Willow asleep beside the hearth with her wrapped paw stretched out like royalty, Grace kneeling to wipe rainwater from the floor while pretending she was not laughing at Scout's towel victory. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "It does." Days passed and the cabin learned new music. Scout's nails clicked across the floor at dawn. Willow made soft dreaming sounds by the fire. Bowls clinked, blankets shifted. Grace came by often, sometimes with puppy food, sometimes with clean bandages, sometimes with no excuse at all, except that she had forgotten whether Ethan knew how to boil chicken properly. She was still careful with him, but not distant. She filled the rooms without crowding them. Ethan began repairing things he had ignored for weeks: the loose porch rail, the leaking window frame, the stovepipe that smoked when the wind came from the north. He told himself the puppies needed a safer place. Maybe that was true. But with each nail hammered, each hinge tightened, each board replaced, the cabin seemed to look back at him and say, "Finally." 2 weeks later, Ethan accepted a security position at a mountain resort outside Asheville. The manager, Mark Reynolds, was a broad, clean-shaven man in his early 50s with close-cropped gray hair, a square face, and the brisk friendliness of someone who had spent years handling guests, complaints, and winter emergencies without raising his voice. Mark looked over Ethan's resume, then at the quiet steadiness in his posture. "You don't seem like a man who misses much," he said. Ethan glanced toward the parking lot, where Grace waited in the truck with 2 puppies asleep in a crate they had entered willingly after many patient days and many pieces of chicken. "I'm trying to notice different things now," he said. Mark hired him on the spot. The work gave Ethan structure without swallowing him. He walked resort paths at sunrise, checked doors, watched weather, guided lost guests back to warm lobbies, and came home before dusk to a cabin that no longer met him like an empty room. Scout greeted him first every evening, racing around the porch in wild circles, one ear still proudly imperfect, his body filling out now with food and safety. Willow waited near the door, quieter, softer, her wrapped paw healing well, her pale nose streak bright against her dark muzzle. She did not rush the world. She studied it, then chose her place within it. And the gifts continued. One morning, Ethan found a round stone beside his boot. Another day, a red maple leaf lay on the top step, placed so neatly it seemed arranged by a tiny priestess of autumn. Once, after a week of sunshine, Scout and Willow dragged a branch twice their combined length across the yard, working with such grim teamwork that Ethan had to sit down on the porch because he was laughing too hard to stand. Grace arrived just in time to see the branch jam sideways against the steps, both puppies pulling in opposite directions, neither willing to admit the plan needed revision. Her laughter joined his, bright and sudden, and for a moment the whole mountain seemed to lean closer to hear it. That evening, Ethan took scraps of pine from the shed behind the cabin and built a small wooden box. His hands moved carefully, not with military precision this time, but with something gentler. He sanded the edges smooth, fixed the lid with 2 old brass hinges, and set it on the kitchen table. Inside, he placed the first chewed piece of wood, the green bottle cap, the frayed cord, the wet leaf dried flat between pages of an old field guide, the gray stone, the blue cloth, the red maple leaf, and the round stone from the porch. None of it was beautiful to anyone else. To Ethan, it was a history of being found. Grace stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. Scout leaned against his boot. Willow slept under the table, her paw twitching in a dream. Ethan closed the lid, then left his palm on the box for a long moment. He had spent so long believing love arrived as something grand enough to prove itself. A vow, a rescue, a sacrifice, a mission with thunder around it. But love had come to him muddy and underfed, carrying trash from the woods like treasure. It had come with one brave puppy who refused to abandon another, one quiet woman who knew not to force healing, one old uncle who gave him a cabin and called it practical, and one wounded man who finally learned that being strong did not mean holding everything. Sometimes it meant becoming safe enough for small, frightened things to rest beside you. Outside, the Blue Ridge evening cleared after days of rain, and sunlight poured through the pines in golden shafts. The cabin no longer sounded like a place waiting to be left behind. It breathed with pause, laughter, wood smoke, and the slow blooming of trust. Ethan looked at Grace, then down at Scout and Willow, and felt a strange, steady miracle of belonging settle around him. The lonely soldier had not vanished. He had simply made room for a family, and in that old cabin stitched together by rain, mud, tiny gifts, and patient love, they all finally came home. Sometimes God does not send his miracles with thunder in the sky or angels at the door. Sometimes he sends them quietly, on 4 tiny paws, carrying a wet piece of wood, an old bottle cap, or a leaf no one else would ever notice. Ethan thought he had been forgotten, but through Scout and Willow, he learned that love can still find us in the places where we hide. And maybe that is true for all of us. In our everyday lives, blessings often arrive small. A kind word, a loyal friend, a second chance, a creature who needs us just when we believe we have nothing left to give. So today, do not ignore the little signs of grace around you. Someone, somewhere, may still need your kindness. And perhaps God is already using something small to lead you back home. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, faith, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your home, comfort your heart, and remind you that you are never truly alone.